Welcome, folks, to this latest CSEE member webinar. This is number 4 or 5, I actually can't remember. And really happy today to be able to have 3 experts to talk about some really important things, and that is animal care and human research ethics. These are big topics for us, and as a society, we're pretty familiar with animal care, many of us. But a lot of people don't quite realize how far that extends, and Laura will say something about that. Laura Weir from St. Mary's University is here to talk about animal care. Laura is a long-term member of CSEE and our council. She works on the ecology, evolution, and mating systems in freshwater fish, and she has long experience working with animal care committees. The other thing that's happened, of course, during COVID is a lot of us have pivoted to do research that involves things like online surveys, data gathered from online surveys, data from community science projects, things like that. And that brings us into a sphere that we don't know a lot about, and that's human subjects research. And often your first reaction is, what? I'm not doing human subjects research. I think Dave has heard me utter that very phrase, in fact. And so I'm pleased to introduce Renee Audet-Martel, who is our manager of research ethics at UNB. She has about 20 years experience in our Office of Research Services and is deeply knowledgeable about research ethics boards in general. And the current chair of our UNB Research Ethics Board is Dr. Dave Colaman. Dave's an engineer with research interests in geomatics and GIS, so many of us as ecologists depend heavily on the kinds of things Dave has worked on. But today he's here because since his retirement, he's been serving as chair of our Research Ethics Board. What I'm going to do is suggest I'll turn it over first to Renee and Dave to give their sort of high-level introduction to human subjects research, what it is, how you go about deciding if you need approvals and how you get them. We'll then turn things over to Laura to do similar things with animal care. And then following both of those short presentations, we'll open up the floor for questions to any of the presenters. So that's the plan. And then I think with that, I'll turn things over to Renee and Dave.
Okay, very good. Now we'll get things started. Thank you, Steve. Steve, I would ask you if you wouldn't mind to give us a 3-minute warning, please.
Our timing is pretty flexible, but I will sort of give you in about 15 minutes. I'll warn you that we should wrap up. How's that?
Very good. That sounds fine. Okay. Well, thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. We're both delighted to be here. Renee and I are going to be a tag team through this, so I'll take the first couple of slides to just provide some context for how this whole formalized interest in research ethics got started in not just Canada, but North American universities, and then pass it over to Renee to talk a bit about when you should consider applying to your research ethics board for approval for your research project. As early as, or as recently rather, as the 1940s and 50s, through the war years, and then after that, there wasn't the same measure of ethical concern about a research as there is now, and so as a result of that, not just in Europe, but here in North America, there were numerous examples of experiments being done on people who are mentally ill, perhaps people of poorer backgrounds, other ethnicities, and so on, without any due regard for informed consent, or even telling people what was involved or the risks involved. Things came to a head in the 1960s in both countries when the media started becoming aware of these activities, prompting some federal governments to step in to start not necessarily regulating things, but if they were going to be a major funder of university research, they wanted a say in making sure that ethical concerns were taken into account. Here in Canada, we've got the three research councils, NSERC, SSHRC, and the Medical Research Council, or Council of Health Research, um, have come together to look at developing a framework of policies for responsible conduct of research, and putting their funding responsibilities out there as clout to make sure that universities and other related research institutions made followed their rules or followed the spirit as well as the letter of those rules. I include in these slides, and I've given Steve a copy of the slide handouts for later on, so you can see these links to these particular pages to provide more details on what governs our concerns in that regard. And finally, here in our university, our research ethics board, along with many other university research ethics boards across Canada, was created in the mid 1970s at the request of the research councils. One of the other requests was to develop a university policy on research involving humans and set up a research ethics board to monitor through applications the research on with human subjects that was going on. In our case here at UNB, we have 7 members from across the Fredericton campus, and myself as chair, plus community members as well. Here at UNB, Fredericton, the chair is traditionally a retired faculty member, but policies vary across the country. Renee, may I turn it over to you for talk about the principles in the next few slides?
Absolutely. So the guiding principles that are associated to the Tri-Council policy statement on research involving humans involve such things as being respectful of human dignity, to ensure that you have free informed consent from your participants, to be aware of vulnerable populations, and to ensure privacy and confidentiality of your participants, and not just of the data that you are, not just in the moment when you're collecting that data, but ensuring that that confidentiality is protected throughout the life of the data that you are going to use. Also justice and inclusiveness, and the need to balance harms and benefits. This is all captured in Chapter 1 of the Tri-Council policy statement if you want some really good reading for tonight. So next slide, please, Steve.
Oh, there you go.
Or Dave, I guess. So what is meant by the term research involving humans? As you can all imagine, research can be defined a number of ways. So we defer to the meaning in the Tri-Council policy statement, which is that research is an undertaking intended to extend knowledge through a disciplined inquiry and or systematic investigation. We oftentimes have to use our best powers of interpretation when it comes to the Tri-Council policy statement, because I think they purposefully do not want to be too rigid. They want to err on the side of caution in a lot of areas, but they also want to be inclusive in their language to help out the REBs to figure out exactly how they fit within the words of the policy. Next slide, please. So what does it include? I'm sure there's a lot of things that come to mind immediately. We all, have had our fair share of exposure to things like clinical trials, drug trials, those sorts of things. And of course, those are all well within the reach of the REB, but it's more than that. It's research that involves obtaining factual or opinion-based responses from human participants. You're asking people for their opinions. You're going to someone's door, or you're sending them a survey and you want to know something about what they do or who they are. That falls under our purview. Pilot studies to assess the feasibility of a larger subsequent research project falls within our purview, as well as course-based research activities, even where the primary purpose may be pedagogical. The one thing I'd like to say on this slide is that there are two very common misconceptions when it comes to research that is reviewable by the Research Ethics Board. One, that it's only research that's funded by Tri-Council. That's a misconception. And two, that it's only research that you intend to publish. That's not the case. It's one factor, but it's not the only factor. Next slide, please. Is this still my slide?
It is. Yep.
Okay. So there's this whole concept in the Tri-Council policy statement about proportional assessment. And it ranges from studies that include absolutely no risk to very high risk. And risk is also not a factor that determines whether or not it's REB reviewable. We review everything, the whole gamut. So it's not just physical injury risk either. The thing that you need to understand is that it's also risk of embarrassment, risk of a loss of privacy, emotional distress, business disclosure, and inconvenience. Those are all things that you have to keep sort of at the forefront of your mind.
Just something to add there before we leave that slide. Typically, if applications fall into the no risk or minimal risk category, they can be turned around fairly quickly, and they're typically handled by, well, by yours truly, the chair of the board, as being delegated him. But in certain cases where there's a higher risk involved, or there are elements of deception or risk to the not just to the research participants necessarily, but in some cases risk to the researcher as well, those kinds of projects are typically reviewed by the entire research board. Thankfully, they're few and far between, but they do come along from time to time. Now, what's more important is, perhaps from this perspective, is what's not up for review by the research board necessarily. And take this with a grain of salt, because usually we err on the side of caution. But according to the Tri-Council guidelines, if the research relies exclusively on information that's in the public domain, that's out there, protected by law, or if it involves living individuals who might be, well, for example, in the public eye all the time and with not a lot of expectation of privacy, or in situations where you're observing people in public places, and even there's strict conditions, that's typically exempted from REB review. That's not seen as being of virtually any risk, or almost no risk to the participants involved. Similarly, if the research involves or relies exclusively on what's called secondary use of anonymous information, or anonymized human biological materials, so long as there's no way where the researchers themselves can attach a name or a social insurance number, any method of, or an address, any method of identification of an individual to a piece of information, then in those cases that's exempted from REB review. But it's always important to check with the REB before you just assume that your research falls into one of these areas. It's not enough just to claim it's anonymous or whatever. There are ways, and an increasing number of ways these days, where data can be tracked back to the source in a variety of different ways.
Just a note on the secondary use there, Dave, if you don't mind.
Sure.
We really pay quite a bit of attention to this section of the Tri-Council policy statement, because the secondary use of data, there are some misconceptions in that realm as well. And one of them is that if someone has signed up for one study and you have the data and you later on decide, well, I have this data, I want to do this secondary study. It's not as easy as just doing the second study, even though the data is anonymized. Your participants needed to have been informed that there was the possibility of a secondary study. And so only if it's not feasible to go back and ask for that secondary use, will you actually be allowed to proceed. So I just wanted to make sure that you all understood that if you have these data banks of information available to you, you really should check with your REB if you want to use them for a secondary reason.
Right. Also, activities that don't require REB review, there's a lot of them that occur in universities that may involve interviews with people, but they aren't necessarily research per se. Quality assurance or quality improvement studies, performance reviews, whether they're of a faculty member or a staff member, or a program evaluation of a particular degree program that all of us go through from time to time. Those do not require REB review. We often have interviews that are in fact oral tests, or just tests in general. Testing within normal educational requirements, when it's only used for the assessment or management, or sometimes the improvement of the courses, that's fine. The moment that you want to take those results, though, and compare them with results from a previous year or from another university or whatever, to answer a particular research question, that's where the line's been crossed, and we want to make sure that the students have that every effort has been made to obtain informed consent for those responses. And finally, creative practices in and of themselves. There's sometimes research that will employ creative practice to obtain responses. That's where we want to draw the line. If it's just a creative practice that invites critique or criticism, that's not research. The moment that we're using a particular piece of art or a particular piece of music to do research into people's responses, we've crossed out the line into things that do require REB review. Renee, back to you.
Just before you do, I'll give you that sort of 3 or 4 or 5 minute warning you asked.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, so how do you start your application process? So the first thing you should do is start even before you know you have a project. Before you have everything outlined, contact your research ethics office before the funding is in place, just so you know exactly what it is that you're going to need to maybe set aside some funding for. Your ethics offices are usually right within your Office of Research Services or under the Vice President Research Office. and they would have specific forms. Each university or institution would have developed their own type of forms. Now, also, what I should say is that at UNB we have the one REB on each of our campuses that reviews everything. Some institutions will have multiple REBs. Some will have a strictly social science REB, a strictly clinical trial REB. So, you know, you'll need to figure out which REB would be the best one to submit to.
Oh, sorry.
Secondly, there's this concept of ongoing review with respect to research ethics applications. So you're going to have your original application. Likely you're going to be responsible to submit, and you'll get X amount of time to conduct the study in your original application. At UNB, we provide 3 years of certification. And then from there, we expect an annual report every year from the researchers. It's a 1-pager. It's really easy, just basically telling us how things are going, how many people have taken part, have there been any adverse events, whatever. And then there's a final report due within 90 days of completion of your project. And this concept of ongoing review involves any modifications that you're going to make over your study. Say you just decide, if it's a survey, you want to add a question. You get so far in and you think, you know, I really think I want to ask them this as well. You have to go back to your REB and just let them know that you want to add something or you want to take something away. And then, of course, there's extension requests. So if your study is going to go beyond the original certification timeline that you've been provided, you'll need to come back and ask for an extension. And also, just a note, our REB reviews quite a number of external requests to UNB for access to our populations. So, you know, researchers from other universities have often come knocking on our door asking if they can publicize their projects through our systems. And in order to do that, we would request that we see their applications and their certification or their award or their approval letters to move forward.
Okay, and I'll just say this: we've also included in our handout to you just a few slides with tips on how to prepare the application and tips to make the review work fairly quickly. The turnaround time on these typically is seasonals. You know, certainly this time of year, as research projects get underway, we can see a large amount of activity. Other times of year that it's less. So the turnaround time can vary. One of the principal determinants on the turnaround time is how complete your application is, and a good complete application gets turned around fairly quickly. I think we'll stop there and let Laura take over, and then we'll take questions after that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks, Renee. So yeah, I think we're going to move to Laura and let her talk about animal care in a similar way, and then we'll have general questions after that. So Laura, take it away. Can see your screen, but can't hear you.
Now you can, right?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Steve. So as Steve mentioned earlier, I'm here in my capacity as a representative for CSEE on the Canadian Council for Animal Care. So we have a number of member institutions and societies that actually kind of sit on this panel. And we're a part of this bigger group that kind of has input in terms of what it's like to work with animals in various different facets of research and teaching in Canada. And so when Steve asked me to do this and informed me that we're talking about treating our study organisms well, My hope is that we all kind of have that in mind already, but I will talk a little bit about where information about that comes from. And so this is more geared to the ins and outs of working with animals in research and teaching. And unsurprisingly, it's not that much different than working with humans. So we can't necessarily get informed consent from the animals. So we do have to think about different ways that we can make sure that they're being treated ethically. And so just really, really briefly to talk about this sort of overarching body. So we have these national bodies on both sides that take care of thinking about best practices in research. And so the CCAC, or the Canadian Council on Animal Care, is a national peer review, not-for-profit organization whose responsibilities include thinking about the best practices in terms of the use of animals in science in Canada. And I'm reminded by them, and in consultation with them about this particular webinar, their kind of mandate is to think about the Canadian people. So we're acting in the interest of the Canadian people and their interest in what we do with animals in research and teaching. And so when we think about it from that perspective, as ecologists and evolutionary biologists, we do typically hear things about mice in cages and farm animals, and that's certainly a big focus for the CCAC. But we've seen over the recent years a great expansion in terms of thinking about a diversity of different kinds of animals. And so that's one of the reasons that CSEE is part of this member body, is to expand this, because we do use animals in research and teaching. And so from our perspective, when we're thinking about the importance of this, is that the CCAC, through input from experts and volunteers and various different facets of science and veterinary research, what they do is they create and provide guidelines. And these guidelines, of course, are constantly changing in terms of what reflects the ethical use of animals. And so those are the kinds of things that we as researchers are kind of trying to make sure that we refer to when we're thinking about the use of animals in research and teaching. And so basically we're trying to make sure that we're treating our animals well. And so if you've been at a university for any length of time, either as a grad student or a professor, you know there's always that like visit every few years, and the CCAC is coming and we clean up the lab and make sure that everything looks good. And that's because they're coming in to kind of check up on how things are going in terms of whether or not we're meeting the criteria that are laid out. And so they do hold a little bit of clout in terms of being able to offer certificates of good practice and having some influence over whether or not grants, so NSERC and CIHR are kind of the big ones that can be, never have been, but can be limited if best practices are not being followed. And so this is supposed to be a collaborative interaction with the CCAC. They are there to help us understand their guidelines, but there is a little bit of a clout in terms of being able to influence what happens at the universities. So the parts that matter for us as researchers and teachers are actually not the CCAC, but rather our institutional animal care committee. So much like research ethics boards, we have committees in place in institutions, and depending on the size of the institution, the committee will vary, how often they meet will vary, but there are generally some patterns that we see. And of course, there's a hierarchical structure involved in this that I don't want to get into. But ultimately, if we're thinking about what we want to do in terms of resources for thinking about working with animals, either through the research or teaching stream, the Animal Care Committee should be kind of our best resource, and we should be using them to our advantage to ask some questions about what we can and should be doing with our animals. I put this on here to remind myself that I should mention it. So this is kind of the gold standard that we're all striving for. So in collaboration with the Animal Care Committee, if you probably have a GAP certificate, Good Animal Practice certificate at your institution, most institutions do. And so these are the kinds of things that we display proudly on the lab doors to show that we're treating the animals ethically. And so I wanted to get into a little bit about what is an animal. And so as biologists, we probably have a pretty good idea about what we think, but animals are not all of the animals that may come to mind. And so from the perspective of thinking about the use of animals in teaching and research, the ones that are focused on the most and require the most thought and the most paperwork are non-human vertebrates and cephalopods. So if you ask a 9-year-old to list you some animals, this is what they do. And this is actually pretty well covering most of what we see in terms of what we would expect from a typical human who lives in this country who's not a researcher to think of as an animal. And so we do have this kind of more restricted definition, and I'll address the issue of invertebrates and what's required of them in a couple of slides. And I did just want to point out in terms of thinking about animal use, these are data that are compiled yearly by the CSEE about which animals are used the most frequently in research and teaching in our country. And we can see that the popular ones like mice and farm things, which are what most people think about when they think about animals and animal research, are actually at the top of the list. I'm proud to say that fish make it on there as well. And I will talk specifically about fish and some special things that happen with them at the end of this particular talk. So that's just a short definition about what an animal is. And I'm not saying that one shouldn't worry if one is working with invertebrates in terms of thinking about what needs to happen with respect to animal care, but this is what require the kinds of procedures that I'm going to talk about in the next little while. And so if we're thinking about working with animals, either in teaching, in research, we can think about what we might need approval for. And so much like kind of the default that's suggested for human research, assume that you need it for everything and ask. So our animal care committee should be able to help us figure that out. And if not, they can call the CCAC and kind of work that out in terms of what's required. And so I've divvied this up into teaching and research, and I keep reminding myself to say teaching because we do need to go through a relatively rigorous process to use animals in teaching as well. And so if we're thinking about using animals on either side of the slide, what has to happen is before we even get into the fun part with filling out forms and thinking about numbers, both require that they meet merit. And so there'll be pedagogical merit for a teaching activity, and there'll be scientific merit for research activities. A lot of times when we apply for grants that are peer reviewed, that falls under the umbrella of scientific peer review and therefore kind of meets merit. But when we're thinking about teaching activities, often, we dream up something we think we want to do, and we have to remind ourselves we probably can't do it next week because we have to go through this procedure of consulting others to make sure it meets pedagogical merit. And so all of that has to take place even before you submit a regular animal protocol that gets reviewed by your animal care committee. So a completely different review process for merit. It's not done by animal care or ethics interested people. It's done by teaching or research experts. And so once we get to a point where that approval has happened, then we can think about needing approval to actually use the animals. And so when we're thinking about these kinds of activities, typically what your institution will have is called an animal use protocol. These vary from place to place, but they will have some things that are relatively common. And so this is the fun part about filling out the forms, making sure they're in on time. And as expected, there'll be a lot of variation from university to university. And so those kind of specific things about timelines are something you might want to check in with your local animal care committee about, just to make sure that all of those are being met. And so, for example, at my institution, if something requires peer review, it has to be in 5 weeks before the committee would meet to look at the protocols, and then the protocols have to go in a couple of weeks before that. So there's a little bit of a timeline issue. So it requires more forethought than I will admit I was ever used to using. But it is kind of a good thing to make sure that this is all rigorous, and more importantly, that it's required. So I'll talk a little bit about that next. And so important things that we need to consider when filling out these kinds of things are directly related, in my opinion, to thinking about what the CCAC calls their 3 Rs. So unlike, well, they're very similar to reduce, reuse, recycle. So those were things we kind of thought about when recycling programs were starting in the 90s. And this is kind of a similar idea. So thinking about alternatives and how we can maybe reduce how many animals we're using. And so this slide is a bit texty, but I did want to kind of make sure that we had this as a record. And so the first thing to think about really hard, because these are the kinds of things that we maybe want to gloss over because we're focused on thinking about the research we want to do, is that we need to show that there is something that is a non-human, there isn't something that's a non-human vertebrate or that's not a cephalopod that we could use instead to answer the same question. And I will say parenthetically that I have used and often use, I need to use this species because it does this special thing. And so far, so good with that. I can't guarantee that will work, but usually one can argue that one needs to use their particular taxon of interest because they're interested in it because of something special about it. If you do find a substitute that you think you might want to use, either in teaching or research, the fun thing is that even if they don't fall under the vertebrate or cephalopod categories, care may have form call for these. And so these are shorter forms for dealing with different kinds of animals that are invertebrates that aren't cephalopods. And so when we're thinking about this idea of alternatives, this is one of the R's, so this is replacement in the CCAC language. The second thing that we want to do is keep numbers as low as possible. And so we want to reduce the number of animals that are being used, that we're using for our purposes in research. And when it's appropriate and possible, animals can be potentially reused to reduce the total number that are there. And so from my experience, numbers are always the question that comes up when I submit protocols. And so thinking about that really hard is worth it in the long run. And so this is reduction in CCAC language. And then finally, and this is one of these kind of always changing things with respect to the guidelines, is to think about refining what you're doing. And so we often have changes in the kinds of, say, anesthetics that we can use. There's increased interest, I think, validly, for making sure that animals are in environmentally enriched areas. And so there will be changes in terms of how this works from, one year to the next, potentially, for the particular kinds of animals that we may be using. And so we want to keep them happy, and this is called refinement. So these are kind of the things that we like to focus on in these protocols, just to make sure that all of these parts of CCA's mandate are being met. So we know that we're doing the best we can to treat our animals ethically and using current best practices. And so animal use protocols, again, will vary from university to university or across different government institutions, et cetera. And so the advice that I have, similar to advice about research ethics with humans, is make sure that you give as much relevant detail as possible. So you're kind of in a collaborative relationship, or should be, with your local animal care committee. And we're trying, all of us, to treat the animals well, while also being allowed to use them in teaching and research. So it's not a test. We do need to pass it, but we probably need to aim a little bit higher than just that, or we're going to have this come back for further discussion. And so this does tend to be an iterative process. And so it's more than likely that you'll be asked questions, and that's okay. This is just the review process doing its job, much like manuscript reviews, and it shouldn't be about the scientific or pedagogical merit of the project, but rather about the procedures that are being used with respect to the treatment of the animals in the study or in the teaching lesson. And so that's just the general advice about doing this, to reduce the amount of times one has to fill out forms and go back and forth with the committee and delay the start of actually doing the work. And finally, once you are interacting with animals, these are lessons learned just through trial and error. A couple of things just to note, keep track of what happens. So count the animals, record how many there are. If something bad happens, it's really important to record that too. If something like kind of bad happens, it's always good to check if this is qualifying as an incident. And so there are definitions of incidents that vary a little bit from institution to institution. And these incidents need to be reported to help inform best practices. They're also something that goes directly to your veterinarian, and usually you're encouraged to consult the veterinarian before you submit the exciting incident form. And I've found, at least personally for me, one of the interesting things about going through this is that the vets who are associated with our institution don't know a lot about tiny fish that live in really gross environments. And so we've had this opportunity to kind of have back and forth about the different points of view on how this works. And the vets, of course, also know a lot that we might not, and where to send things for toxicology checks or other kinds of kind of sad situations that may arise. So that's another thing to keep track of. And I do stress the counting because every year you will be forced to submit numbers. And I say forced because this is how the CCAC keeps track of animal use and can report this then back to the Canadian public. So this typically happens every year in March, and every year in March, I'm surprised that it's happening, but that's kind of the pattern. And so you'll need to submit numbers for use in terms of what you've done with the animals. And finally, I did just want to speak to this, which is to end this on like a sad low note for some weird reason. If something really bad happens, like half your population suddenly doesn't have any water and therefore can't survive, it's really important to say something. So accidents happen, and knowing that they have happened helps prevent what's potentially things in the future. And I will say that if there are infrastructure issues that lead to these accidents, then the CCAC can lean on the university administration to improve that infrastructure. So in that sense, it's kind of a nice conversation to have. And I will mention that most of the major incidents that we do see in terms of large amounts of animals getting sick or dying involve fish. And this is because of a lack of water or water quality issues. And so if you do work with fish, it's kind of important to keep in mind that they do rely on us to supply the medium from which they obtain oxygen. And so it's important for us to make sure that we're kind of taking care of them really well. So reporting this immediately, and it has to go up the chain and end up at the CCAC within 10 days of the occurrence, or some, complicated things can happen from the point of view of these certificates that are issued to your institution. And so that is the information that I wanted to relay today. So I just want to thank Steve for doing this. This is kind of a nice change in terms of talking about different things. And with that, I will stop my share, and I guess we can start the questions.
Thanks very much to all three of you.